Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Serwer, editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance, and I want to welcome you to our third Election 2020 special presented to you in conjunction with HuffPost and Yahoo News. Tonight, we're on my home terrain as we're going to go deep into the economy and how it's played in the campaign so far and what to watch 3 weeks between now and Election Day. I'm joined, as I've been each week, by my co-host, Yahoo News editor-in-chief Dan Klaidman, and HuffPost Washington bureau chief Amanda Terkel. Nice to see both of you guys again.
Hey, Andy, good to be here.
Yeah.
Amanda, let me start with you. Just how important are economic issues when it comes to the election this time around?
As always, they're important. They're the most important thing, which is why you always see candidates running ads on economic issues and trying to focus on talking about those things. You know, in this election, as in all others, but I think this election more so, you have them so intertwined with what is going on right now. You have the coronavirus pandemic, and you have Democrats arguing that Trump and his administration have not done enough on it, and that congressional Republicans have gone along with that, saying, look, because Trump failed to address it, the economy hasn't been able to be restarted. Whereas you have Trump and Republicans making the case that if it's up to Democrats, they would just lock down the economy for as long as possible. They're not interested in restarting it. They're more interested in, wearing masks and taking these precautions that aren't really necessary. And so right now you have Congress and the administration looking at, are they going to do another stimulus deal, which, everyone agrees is actually needed? The question is, what's it going to look like? Who is it going to target? And how big is it going to be?
Yeah, Dan, I want to ask you kind of the same question. And the stimulus deal, I guess, is where COVID and the economy meets. It seems like the average American's getting a raw deal here, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And once again, it is because of the utter and total dysfunction in Washington. The fact that that Congress, when people are desperate for money and for relief in ways that they have not been in generations, and Congress can't act, won't act. So maybe that will change over the course of the next week or two. But there seem to be, so many incentives, ideological and political incentives on both sides not to act that, I don't know that it'll happen. And I think that is part of the reason that Americans are really gloomy right now. One of the sort of paradoxes in this election is that consistently, Donald Trump has led Joe Biden in really all of the polls on the question of who would handle the economy better. Our latest Yahoo News YouGov poll has it at 47-41 in favor of Trump. But at the same time, Americans are very gloomy about the state of the economy right now, not just right now, but also going forward into the near future. 45%, so a plurality of those polled, think that the economy is getting worse, and only 29% say it's getting better. And if you're, and then we asked, what if we were able to stop the spread of the virus? A full 53% of the American people say it would take a year or more just to get things to start improving. So, I think when people go to the polls, they think about, what is happening in their lives right now. I don't know that they project out, several years ahead to think, who will do better then.
Yeah. And, one of the kind of curious hallmarks of this time of COVID, if you will, has been the fact that we had inequality in this country, and it was a problem. But COVID seems to have exacerbated inequality, Amanda. And I know that you guys have written about how billionaires have gotten even more rich because, you look at those tech companies and they've just benefited tremendously, and those CEOs and the top executives have gotten richer and richer. And I wonder if inequality is something that you think is resonating with voters and has become kind of a hot button issue.
I think it is with some voters. I think a lot more voters look at how they're doing, and whether Biden will help them or whether Trump has helped them, and whether they blame Trump for what is going on. Were they doing well before the coronavirus pandemic and they don't think that this is his fault, or do they think look, Trump could have done a lot more? But certainly inequality has been a big issue on the left, but that's not it's not exclusively on the left. It's not exclusively in cities. I've been out to rural areas where you have sort of agricultural monopolies, and you have that sort of rural poverty, rural inequality as an issue that resonates with a lot of people out there, and that doesn't get talked about quite as much by the national media. So, again, people see that, can they afford health care? They don't have child care right now. They don't have their job. How much do they blame Trump? And do they think Biden will make that better? I think is what people will be looking at.
Andy, I think there's a more kind of destructive or insidious divide in this country right now, not just between the sort of 1% that we talk about and the 99%. There's a real, and I think caused by this coronavirus pandemic, a real sort of blue collar, white collar divide. Trump has been talking about the V-shaped recovery, whereas Biden talks about a K-shaped recovery, and that is that white collar, blue collar divide. At the top leg of the K, white collar workers, people who can work from home, people in the tech sector, or frankly, people like us in the media, and have been able to continue to do their jobs. And then there's the lower leg of the K, people who actually have to gather with people, who have to go places, people in the service economy, people in certain trades, and those people can't go back to work. And so, I think that is going to have real political consequences going forward unless it's reversed and reversed fairly soon.
All right, much more to talk about when it comes to the economy, but we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by HuffPost senior reporter Arthur Delaney to talk about the government stimulus. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're now joined by HuffPost senior reporter Arthur Delaney. Arthur, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So a week ago, President Trump said stimulus negotiations were over until after the election. But since then, we've seen some action from both sides. Kind of confusing to keep track of. What's the latest from your perspective?
Well, one thing to always remember is that President Trump is weird and not involved in these negotiations ever, even though he will occasionally send tweets that appear to affect what's happening. The negotiations are between Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi, and the two sides in recent weeks have come closer to each other's positions a little, but it's not very promising. And just today, Nancy Pelosi sent a letter to her colleagues basically trashing the most recent offer from the Trump administration.
Hey, Arthur. So do you think can you talk a little bit more about what Pelosi is thinking? If, you've written about how people actually really do need more relief, do need stimulus funds. She obviously wants a bigger bill than what the administration is proposing, but do you think she's wise in holding out for something bigger, or is she going to get blamed if nothing ends up going through?
I think it's a really complicated decision with like a matrix of factors going into it. Obviously, she says she's holding out for a better deal. There's a lot of agreement on some basic things like extra unemployment insurance, money for states, money for schools. But in each of those, the amount of money, there's still disagreement. And then there are other things like PPE for election workers and more money to secure the election. And then the Republicans want to disallow lawsuits against businesses and schools related to coronavirus exposure. So there's agreement on some things, no agreement on others. And it seems like there's growing pressure on Pelosi to just take what she can get. Now, she may not want to do that because incidentally, it would help millions of people and alleviate pointless material suffering. It would also potentially help the president because he would get to send out checks with his name on them to like 120 million households. And that could be a powerful thing for him heading into an election. These could be measures that Pelosi could get closer to the election or after the election, especially if Democrats take the Senate. So there's a lot that she's factoring in. And I don't know how much she's anticipating an election result that's more favorable to Democrats. But if I had to guess, I would say that's clearly a factor. In her letter today, she did say that Trump just wants to put his name on checks. And I think the implication is there that she doesn't want to let him have that. She'd rather wait.
So
Arthur, go ahead.
Go ahead. Dan. I was just going to go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Arthur, you said that, talked about Trump being weird and not always involved in this process. But he did recently say that he wanted to go big, which was a reversal of his position about not doing a deal until after the election or to be targeted. But I wonder, just politically, if we're seeing how much of a divide we're seeing between Republicans on the Hill and the president, and what the political incentives are for Republicans to stick to their guns, either do a much smaller deal or no deal at all, because some of them might be thinking about life in Washington beyond Trump and maybe getting back to sort of traditional fiscal conservatives, which is what the Republicans have always been about.
That's a terrific point. There clearly is and always has been a big divide between traditional Capitol Hill Republicans and their lobbyists and President Trump, who has always had a sort of liberal economic policy agenda where he supports paying money to workers and dishing out checks. He doesn't care how much it's going to cost. That's actually really popular with all voters, not just Democrats, also Republicans, but the Republican elite hates that. And that may be another reason that Nancy Pelosi is hesitant to make a deal with Trump, because what if Mitch McConnell doesn't let it get a vote? We already know that a majority of Senate Republicans, who could be crucial here, don't like this. It would be a handful of Senate Republicans and then the Democrats who pass this. So and there are different incentives for them. Do they not like it just because they think Trump is toast and don't want to waste money helping him? Did they not like it just because they hate giving money to workers because that's a burden on employers who may have to raise wages due to the macroeconomic effect of all that money sloshing around? There are a few reasons that Republicans might be against it, and that could also be factoring in to Nancy Pelosi's hesitancy to agree to the White House deal.
Arthur, speaking of the president, let's hear what he had to say specifically about why he thinks this deal's not happening right now.
Well, Republicans want to do it. We're having a hard time with Nancy Pelosi. She thinks she can influence the election, and I think they're hurting themselves by not doing it. But the Republicans want to do it. We want to do stimulus. We want to help the airlines again because the airlines are always a tough business. We want to help the restaurants, hotels. We want to help businesses that really it's not their fault. It's China's fault, and we want to help them, Maria. And frankly, we're ready to go. We're all ready to go. We can't get Nancy Pelosi to sign the document.
Arthur, I'm not sure whether it's China's fault or Nancy Pelosi's fault there. But, I mean, it is the case that there's gamesmanship going on here, calculation on both sides, as you've suggested. Do you think it's a legitimate complaint that the Democrats aren't able to compromise at this point? I mean, why not do something smaller?
I think there is a very compelling argument that Democrats ought to just take what they get if what they care about here is helping workers, because what the White House is offering, while much less than what Democrats have sought, is still an incredibly large amount of money, almost $2 trillion. That's more than Republicans let Obama have in the Great Recession. The amount of money the White House is willing to put up for workers, while less than the $600 weekly supplement Democrats want, $400 is still, that's unprecedented. The Congress has never given the unemployed that much money before. So there are some serious wins here. But contrary to what the president said, Republicans are not ready to go. The president's ready to go. Republicans hate this deal completely. Senate Republicans don't like it. They don't want to do it. They would vote against it. House Republicans likely feel the same way. They have ideological reasons, the deficit, too much money for workers. So it's like I was saying before, it's a complicated matrix of factors here. Republicans are definitely not united on this, but it does seem like it's possible that Pelosi could get something through just by making a deal with the White House.
A lot to sort through there. Arthur Delaney, senior reporter from HuffPost, thank you very much for helping us see through all that.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, how the Federal Reserve has shaped the economic debate on the campaign trail. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're now joined by Brian Chung, who covers the Federal Reserve for Yahoo Finance. Brian, good to see you. Good. So can you talk us through the Federal Reserve's actions this year? And are those moves a big reason why President Trump has any sort of economic case to make to the voters?
Well, you know, Andy, it did seem like in 2019, the president was very concerned with what was going on with Fed policy. We don't need to rewind very far to know that the president was very actively tweeting about how disappointed he was with the Federal Reserve not more aggressively cutting rates in the face of the U.S.-China trade war last year. But obviously, the changes in the economy have been very different with the onset of the pandemic at the beginning of this year. And the Federal Reserve now does indeed have interest rates backed up to near zero. So because of that, we haven't heard much from the president with regards to what the Fed policy has been, although it is definitely a case that the president might prefer to see negative interest rates like we've seen in the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, as opposed to what we have right now. But what's important to note is that when it comes to an election as big as this, there are some major implications for what shape the central bank will take on under either a Biden or a Trump administration, although the chatter has not yet begun about whether or not there would be certain names floated under a certain Trump or Biden administration for who would head the central bank. This is the world's largest and most important central bank because it obviously steers and steadies the world's largest economy, which means that whoever ends up taking on the building on Constitution Ave come January next year, or whenever the next Fed chairman is appointed, would really have quite consequential effect on the path of the U.S. economy for the 4 years that follow. So,
Brian, you mentioned Trump's criticism of Jerome Powell. My favorite tweet, by the way, was, "Where did I find this guy, Jerome?" That he tweeted back in 2019. And he says, "I guess you can't win them all." But it raises a question for me: how unusual is it for a president to, for there to be so much open hostility directed at a Fed chairman, a sitting chairman of the Federal Reserve from a president? I recall in the past that there has been tension between, there was tension between Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker, and Andy before the show reminded me that George H.W. Bush blamed Alan Greenspan for his losing the election to Clinton, but happening openly like this?
Yeah, it is indeed very rare. And even when you bring up H.W. Bush, he made those remarks criticizing the Federal Reserve after he had already left office. So to openly criticize a Federal Reserve chairman while you're in office is quite rare. You do have to rewind to 1982 when Reagan, at the time, very politely criticizing, in comparison, the Fed policy. As you mentioned, Volcker raising interest rates quite dramatically in the Volcker shock. Reagan said at the time, quote, "It was the wrong signal." Very different language than what we've heard from the president, who has tweeted on many accounts things like, "Chairman Powell can't putt. He has no touch. He's a terrible communicator. He has no guts." And then the famous August tweet from last year: "Who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Chairman Xi?" Shortly before then, raising tariffs. That was at the end of August last year. It seems like a million years ago, but we do have to remember that that type of language is just completely unusual when it comes to the dynamic between the Federal Reserve and the White House, which tends to have that silo between them. It isn't usually the case that there's kind of partisanship with who's at the Fed, even though it is, of course, a political appointee. You have to remember that Ben Bernanke was appointed by George W. Bush. That was renewed under an Obama administration, even with the change of the political parties. Yellen was appointed by Obama in his second term. And although it did seem like maybe there was the possibility that Trump could keep her at first, he ultimately ended up going with someone else because he wanted to make his mark on the Fed, was the way that he described it. But keep in mind, Jay Powell was a person who's been at the Fed for a long time. He is someone that was actually appointed under the Obama administration, even though he is a registered Republican. But again, the type of language calling him a putter who has no touch, that's extremely, extremely unusual.
Can a president fire a Federal Reserve chairman?
That's a great question. And the discussion of that actually pulled up at the end of last year, or the middle of last year, when Trump was really firing off all these tweets. The answer is no, that at least coming from the Federal Reserve. Now, of course, from the White House, the president had tweeted, actually was on the record as saying he did think he had the authority to do so. It's a good thing there that didn't really end up escalating beyond those types of jawing words, because it's possible that a court would have had to take that up. But
I think Brian Chung's audio went out, so we'll see if we can get him back. In the meantime, we were talking about. Are you back, Brian?
I am. Sorry about that.
I don't know. Maybe got to take a drink of water there or something, right?
I'm still here, I think. If you got me.
Okay. Go ahead. Actually, I think Amanda Terkel has a question. Maybe we can pick it up there. Go ahead, Amanda.
Sure. So, Brian, you mentioned that there haven't been many names floated yet for who Biden might pick if he becomes president for the Fed. So, do you have any indications, though, on what a Biden policy would look like, or a relationship with the Fed would look like, or what type of person he might be looking for?
Well, what's interesting about this is because of the differences that we've seen between President Trump and Chairman Powell, regardless of whether or not it's a Biden or a Trump administration, it's very likely there might be someone new at the head of the Federal Reserve. Now, what's interesting is that we don't have any sort of names floated from inside the Fed yet about who a Biden administration might pick, but you have to consider that former Fed Chair Yellen is or has advised the Biden campaign before. She's not a permanent advisor. The permanent economic advisors to his team are the likes of Heather Boushey from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, in addition to Jared Bernstein, a familiar name in the Obama administration. He's currently at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The others have also advised the Biden campaign on a one-off situation, things like the University of Michigan professor Lisa Cook, in addition to Jake Sullivan. So there are some names that could be influential in picking ultimately who the Fed chair would be under that Democratic administration, but we don't exactly have finalized names yet. Of course, it's possible they could still renominate Powell there. On the Trump side, it does seem like he's been trying for some time to get new names at the Federal Reserve. Keep in mind that we're talking about the chair, but the Fed itself has 5 seats, so 4 in addition to the chair. Currently, there is one vacancy there right now. And what's interesting is that the Federal Reserve has been obviously floating a bunch of names, or rather the White House has floated a bunch of names like Herman Cain, Stephen Moore, as of late, Judy Shelton, a former economic advisor to the Trump campaign. Now, it remains to be seen if they can push that nomination through before the end of this Senate session. But if they are able to do that, people do say that President Trump might want to nominate Judy Shelton as a possible Fed chair to replace Jay Powell. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts. They need to get that Senate nomination confirmed first, and then he would need to re-win the election or win the 2020 election in order to put that person at the top.
Right. Yes. A lot of stuff to potentially sort out after the election, Brian. Thanks very much for that insight. Coming up next, Yahoo News national correspondent Alex Nazarian will join to talk about the coronavirus, its devastating impact on American jobs, and how Joe Biden's approach could be far different from what we've seen from the Trump administration. Stay tuned.
You there?
We're now joined by Yahoo News national correspondent Alexander Nazarian. Alexander, you recently wrote about the Trump administration being in a fiasco vortex. Tell us what that means.
Fiasco vortex is a term that the sort of well-known crisis manager Eric Desenhall, who works here in Washington D.C., came up with, and it indicates a point when the narrative basically slips away from the subject of that narrative. In this case, of course, Trump, and at that point, there's not much a crisis manager or anyone else can do. So essentially, Trump has the narrative, in this case, the narrative of the coronavirus, has slipped the bounds of Trump's ability to control it. And we've seen that quite acutely in the last 2 weeks. I think we've actually seen it in many ways since April. But now it has really gone off the rails with his own diagnosis and everything that has followed. And of course, that's been evident in the handling of a second stimulus package, or I should say the lack of handling, really.
So, Alexander, you have been covering coronavirus since the pandemic started, and it's been front and center in this campaign. I can't remember a presidential campaign when one issue has loomed as large as this one has. Joe Biden has been much stricter about, in terms of his, policy prescriptions, sort of mitigation standards. And he's talked about a national mask mandate. He's talked about keeping the economy much more locked down going forward, as long as this virus continues to spread and doesn't abate. How does he explain how he would deal with the economic toll of that? I mean, you have just the other day a top official at the WHO saying that it's time to end these lockdowns, right. And Biden seems to be going in the opposite direction. So how is he going to sort of explain that?
Right. Well, first of all, a mask mandate could actually be even more effective than lockdowns in stopping the spread of the coronavirus. But if we were to do something resembling a lockdown, and you are correct, there's increasingly evidence that lockdowns are not our best measure of halting viral spread. But were we to do something approaching a lockdown, if we were forced to do it, the only way we could is if we had a stimulus, right? We can't both lock down the economy and then starve businesses and individuals of any sort of aid. We're sort of drowning and strangling the economy at the same time, and it's just an utterly nonsensical approach. And I know there are good people on both sides of the aisle trying to sort of resolve that impasse. But as long as the man in the Oval Office continues to send contradictory and confusing messages, I don't see that impasse being resolved.
So speaking of contradictory and confusing messages, so obviously Trump had tweeted that he was stopping all negotiation, ordering his representatives to stop all negotiations on the stimulus bill. Now they're negotiating again. Can you talk about, from your reporting, what you heard about, what sort of backlash did Trump get to that, from either within the White House, his administration, and within his own party?
A good question, Amanda. I think you'll agree with me that it's basically an open secret at this point that congressional Republicans are exasperated with Trump. I would argue that they have been for a long time. But at this point, he's actually frustrating Mitch McConnell's attempts to get anything done. McConnell has put together this $500 billion proposal, which isn't great, and Pelosi doesn't love it. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, his adversary, in many ways. But still, whatever prospects exist, Trump seems determined to frustrate them, including when it's Steven Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, putting forth ideas. I guess, frankly, it's dismaying to see talks in this state of chaos and confusion, and I can only imagine what it's like Not that we need to have too much sympathy for the good folks on Capitol Hill, but I just cannot imagine trying to do anything approaching legislation in this environment where the White House may issue new directives, or not the White House, Trump, every single day, something new, something that scuttles whatever work has already been done by Democrats and Republicans alike.
Alexander, you talk about promises and statements coming out of the White House, or more specifically, President Trump. That goes for fighting the coronavirus, specifically when it comes to therapies and drugs. And let's listen to what President Trump had to say on that score.
We're producing powerful therapies and drugs, and we're healing the sick, and we're going to recover. And the vaccine is coming out very, very quickly in record time. As you know, it's coming out very, very soon. We have great companies doing it, and they'll be distributing it, and we will through our military very, very rapidly. Through the power of the American spirit, I think, more than anything else. Science, medicine will eradicate the China virus once and for all. We'll get rid of it.
Well, some people have taken to calling the China virus the White House virus, but that's another point. What about this fact, or the question, I guess I should say, of how much the American public blames President Trump for where we are with COVID-19 in terms of the election? I mean, is this just a huge negative for the president, or maybe some people say it's China's fault and he's doing the best he can? What do you think?
Look, no doubt, Chinese biosecurity was lax, may still be lax. That's not why we have more than 7 million people sick and nearly 250,000 dead, right? That's on us. Whatever happened in Wuhan in December, let the WHO adjudicate that. I don't see. In fact, I have never understood what electoral gain Trump sees by just continually blaming China. Leave aside the fact that it's plainly xenophobic. I just don't see the political benefit for him in doing so, nor in continuing to promise things that will clearly not come to pass, right? Johnson & Johnson had a troubling result in its vaccine trial yesterday. A volunteer had some sort of unexplained illness. And that may be nothing, of course, and the trial may well continue apace. But it just, that the incident highlights the fact that we don't know yet that these vaccines will work for sure, and for Trump to keep saying that is dangerous. And I think if you look at, I think a lot of public health professionals are concerned about this and what it does to public trust, what remains of public trust, I should say.
So, Alexander, if we don't get any sort of additional stimulus bill now, say Trump loses, do you think there's any chance something would go through in the lame duck?
No, I don't. Do you, Amanda?
Not really, but I thought maybe you would think something different.
No, because look, do I think if we locked McConnell and Pelosi in a room, which I know sounds like a terrible reality show, that they could come up with something? Maybe Mnuchin and Meadows in there too. I think they could. I think Trump scuttles almost everything himself personally, and I mean, this should have been done. This should have been done in July. Once we saw that a second round was needed, or another round was needed, we should be on the next round after that. Look, I'm not endorsing wanton spending, but we've recovered 42% of our jobs, I believe, since the pandemic began. Our unemployment rate is 7.9%. These are very troubling numbers. We are in critical care here as an economy, and I'm not concerned about the politics of this. I'm concerned about the people who aren't able to find work. And no, Amanda, I'm not. I'm quite pessimistic about the lame duck. Really, the only prospect here is January 21st. And, I know that's a sort of, again, I'm sorry for being a pessimist, but this is, as Danny pointed out, this is what I watch all day. And if I had something brighter to report, I would, but I don't.
All right. One thing's for sure, we're about to find out over the next month or so. Alexander Nazarian, Yahoo News national correspondent, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, guys. I wish I could be the bearer of better news from here from the nation's capital.
Maybe you're wrong. We'll see. We'll find out.
I very much hope I am. Thanks,
Coming
guys.
up next,
Thanks.
Washington meets Wall Street. Greg Valliere joins us to discuss investor sentiment around the election and why he says this year doesn't look like 2016. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're now joined by Greg Valliere, who is Chief U.S. Policy Strategist at AGF Investments. Greg, nice to see you.
Good to see you, my friend.
So here's a nice question for you. What are the closing arguments from both camps as we head towards November 3rd when it comes to the economy?
Well, Sure. Well, I think the Biden argument will be healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. It'll be Obamacare, pre-existing conditions, things like that, where clearly that's the number one issue for women. And I would argue women are the key demographic in the election. For Trump, I think we get a GDP number at the end of this month that'll be very strong. It'll just make up for a weak second quarter, but Trump will brag about the economy late in this month. But I think for him, the big argument, if I were advising him, I'm not, would be to talk about the Biden agenda, which relies so much on tax increases. I think that's an area where Trump could draw some blood.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the stimulus bill, or the possibility of one. If nothing happens, in Wall Street's point of view, who is to blame here?
Well, there's a lot of blame to go around. I think Nancy Pelosi started out with much too ambitious a bill. She seems very unwilling to compromise, even when the number gets closer to hers. But there's blame on Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. The idea that they would accept anything over $1 trillion from Mnuchin and Pelosi, I think, is ludicrous. The Republicans are not going to sign off on a big bill.
And then, when Trump declared that the negotiations were off, obviously that changed. Mnuchin is negotiating again. What was the reaction on Wall Street to that? Did you take him seriously, for example?
It was positive. I mean, what Wall Street tends to rally when they think we've got a deal, tends to sell off when it looks like we don't have a deal. I do think we'll get a deal. I just don't know when. It may not come until the middle of the winter, around inauguration time. I don't think it's going to come before the election, but there are too many really smart people headed by Jerome Powell who are in agreement that we really do need another stimulus, or the economy is going to start to really soften.
Greg, as we're sitting right here talking, Joe Biden has a commanding lead in the polls, double-digit lead in many polls, and significant leads in virtually all of the battleground states. So, pretty good bet right now that he is going to win. If he does, how does Wall Street react? Joe Biden, an undertone of his campaign message has been from the beginning that elect Joe Biden, it'll be a return to normalcy. Trump is known as being fairly erratic, which the markets don't always like. So how does Wall Street react to a Joe Biden win?
I think the markets have priced it in. I think the markets can live with Joe Biden, as you say. He's not erratic. He's fairly moderate on a lot of issues. What I don't know, what's harder to figure out, is whether the markets have factored in a blue wave with the Democrats taking the Senate and obviously keeping the House and taking the White House. That's something I think the markets could be concerned about, because it could speed up the timetable for tax increases and some negative stories for certain sectors, defense, things like that. So I think, yes, the markets would be happy to see Joe Biden get a stimulus bill enacted. But the markets might not be happy if everything here is controlled by the Democrats.
Greg, you talked about how health care might be a great talking point for the Democrats, and it seems like they were listening to you. If you were paying attention during the vice presidential debate, you might have heard, of course, that Kamala Harris talked about that. And it was sort of a big moment for her when she was debating Mike Pence. So take a listen.
And this is very important, Susan.
Yes,
and it's important.
We need to give Vice President.
I'd just like to, he interrupted me, and I'd like to just finish, please. If you have a pre-existing condition, heart disease, diabetes, breast cancer, they're coming for you. If you love someone who has a pre-existing condition, they're coming for you. If you are under the age of 26 on your parents' coverage, they're coming for you.
So, Greg, you did mention this before, but does this really resonate with the electorate?
Oh, absolutely. It certainly resonates with female voters, and I think they're the key demographic. There are a lot of differences between now and 2016. But right now, Joe Biden has better numbers with women than Hillary Clinton did. Right now, the Republicans are in money trouble. They're not able to advertise as much as they hoped because they ran out of money. Right now, I think you've got to say the three key states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are definitely tilting to the Democrats. Those are states that Hillary Clinton lost narrowly. So I see a lot of differences between now and 2016 that would point to, my gut feeling is that Biden's going to win by 5 points, maybe 6, and not a landslide, but I think it will be a margin that would not necessitate a disputed legal challenge that could last well into the winter.
I was just going to ask you about that. So you really sort of envision this thing getting wrapped up by, say, the second or third week of November?
If it's close, obviously, there's two big threats. I mean, one is we may not know on election night. A lot of states, looking at a tidal wave of absentee ballots, may not be able to tell us who won for several days. The other greater threat, of course, is that if Trump appears to have lost narrowly, he'll contest it. I mean, he's so litigious. He'll go to William Barr and say, I want you to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And lest we forget, in the year 2000, it was December 12th before the Supreme Court decided that George W. Bush lost to Al Gore. So, yeah, this could drag on for a while. If the election is close, if Biden wins comfortably, then I think that threat diminishes a lot.
Do you think a potentially drawn out election result, or one where Trump declares that he won, even though he hasn't yet, what sort of instability do you think that will cause in the markets?
Well, it could. I mean, markets hate uncertainty, obviously. It could drag on. We could see litigation going on for quite some time. I think at some point, the Republicans will go to the White House and tell him, just as they told Richard Nixon in 1974, it's time to give it up. I think that there'll be a consensus in the country that this couldn't continue for a long time. But again, I think we underestimate Trump at our own peril. And I think he will do quite a lot to retain the office, even if it appears that he didn't win.
I know that Dan has just said earlier that it looked pretty good for Joe Biden right now. And I think that you wrote a piece, and you just spoke to that a little bit, Greg, about how this is not the same as 2016. But give me the road to victory for Donald Trump. How can he win?
Well, let's look at 2016. I'm not necessarily a believer that we'll repeat it, but in 2016, he had a couple of rallies a day. He showed tremendous energy. And I watched him last night. He didn't cough. He looked pretty vigorous. I think he'll outwork Joe Biden. I think he'll make Biden's veer to the left a big issue. I think he'll brag about the economy. But, in the final analysis, this is a referendum on Trump and his handling of the virus. And based on that, he's in real trouble.
Interesting. All right, Greg Valliere, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
All right, good to see you. Yeah, so long.
We'll be right back with some final thoughts from our panel after this. Welcome back. Before we go, Dan and Amanda, maybe I should ask both of you about another front and center issue this week, and that is the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett. And Dan, let me start with you. I don't know if there is a connection to the economy keeping it on topic or not, but how do you think that's playing out right now?
Well, let me see if I can get to a connection to the economy. But what I'd say is, look, there's not a lot of suspense or drama in this Supreme Court confirmation hearing. The results are pretty much predetermined because the Republicans have the vote, and unless there's something crazy happens, Amy Coney Barrett is going to be confirmed. And so this confirmation hearing, in a lot of ways, has been kind of a proxy for the election, both the presidential election, but also Senate races. There are a number of members of the Senate Judiciary Committee who are in tough reelection campaigns right now. And so what you've seen is on both sides, senators really trying to reach out to specific constituencies for political purposes. And it's really striking on the Democratic side. Here's the connection to the economy. The Democrats have really focused in on the economy, and particularly the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, because of the if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, there's a 6-3 conservative majority, and the ACA being on the docket right after the election. The belief is that she would be a vote to overturn Obamacare. The Democrats understand that in making those arguments, and they've done it with a great deal of drama, just about each one of them, bringing specific stories, kind of heart-wrenching stories about people with pre-existing conditions and other terrible ailments, and what would happen to them if they didn't have health insurance. They know that they are reaching out to the voters that they need, particularly women, suburban voters, independents, and that is all about the campaign. And I think they've prosecuted that pretty well. Republicans have done similar things on the other side to try to humanize Amy Coney Barrett, to talk about her family. But for the Democrats, it's all about health care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of an election issue, moving on from beyond the economy, I think Republicans were hoping to use the Supreme Court nomination to shift away from coronavirus, for example, and to talk about this more. Trump didn't really help that when he tweeted, we're going to put aside a stimulus bill until after the election and focus on the Supreme Court nomination. Yes, many Republicans want that, but a large number of voters really don't. They want some extra help right now in terms of economic relief. Obviously, we've talked about how Trump backtracked, but Democrats are making sure, no way, you're not going to change the subject, even while we're talking about the Supreme Court. As Dan said, that they have been bringing up health care. They have been bringing out people who would be affected if the Affordable Care Act is overturned. And they have been really actually pretty effective at staying on message for this. And so I don't think Republicans are going to get a big boost out of this. And if anything, it's just put some at-risk senators, Susan Collins, for example, Cory Gardner in Colorado, it's put them in tougher spots.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that. Thank you, Amanda and Dan. We'll be back next week to talk about the movement for social justice and the last 2 weeks of the race. Up next, stay tuned for a webinar from Yahoo Finance and the Bipartisan Policy Center on where the two parties stand on the student debt crisis. Thanks so much for watching.